Good morning and welcome to another video on SPC 229 schema. I'm your host and Committee Vice Chair Jason Glazer. Today we are covering three closely related, actually not that closely related data groups. They're all related to surface water heating. One is surface water heating use, the other is tank, and then SolarThermal. We're going to be releasing the ballot at the same time as the video again this week. You can vote immediately, and if discussion changes your mind about the vote, you have until the final deadline to change it. Today is the last video covering surface water heating systems. The first one covered how everything is connected up. The second video showed the most common equipment and associated validation points. This video covers the use and storage as well as how surface water heating systems could be connected to a solar hot water system. As a reminder, if you primarily have a 90.1 background, you may notice that this part of the schema seems like I have a lot more details than necessary. That is because this part of the schema was heavily influenced by what's needed in Title 24, both commercial and residential, which have a more in-depth description of surface water heating. For an Appendix G submittal, only a small subset of the data elements are likely to be required. In general, the schema is intended to aid in validating the transformations between the user's model and the baseline model to make sure they're done correctly, and not intended to be a universal model of everything that can appear in a building or be modeled in a simulation program. So let me zoom into the section that we are talking about today. Oops. So surface water heating equipment all shows up towards the bottom of the diagram. Surface water heating equipment references the zone, which has a child of space, and the space has a child of surface water heating use. That's one of the items we're going to be talking about today. And surface water heating equipment also references SolarThermal. And then the other item that we're talking about today is tank. So the surface water heating use references the distribution system, which can include a tank. So that's how all the different pieces are connected up. So let's go on to the schema. So surface water heating use is the first thing we're going to talk about. And I have this really zoomed in a long way because the type is very small on this part of the schema. So as we've talked about many times, it starts with an ID, reporting name, and notes. The area type is basically a 90.1 enumeration, which shows the type of facility is used to look up the type of baseline surface water heating equipment to be used in the baseline. Water serves type is basically a enumeration identifying the type of fixture. And we'll go through these enumerations in a little bit more detail in a minute. Served by distribution system is just a reference to the surface water heating distribution system that we talked about last time. And this is what actually puts a demand for hot water on that system. The use is a total amount of use for that fixture. And then because there are different types of units that can be used with that, there's an enumeration for the units as well. After that, a multiplier schedule for the use, and then temperature at the fixture that's needed for that use. And then the next two items have to do with heat recovery. So for some systems, for some standards, there may be a requirement for heat recovery at the drain. The first one indicates whether there is a system for heat recovery in the drain, and the second Boolean describes whether it's being used to feed the inlet water from the cold side. So let's go through the enumerations related to this. So the first one was actually a 90.1 enumeration for service water heating space options. And so if you notice, this table corresponds directly to a table in 90.1 Appendix G that lists the different types of facilities, and ultimately those are mapped to either gas or electric water heaters. For the other two enumerations, those are fixture options. Let me get that one open. Here we are. So these describe the different types of service water heating fixtures. So shower, bath, etc., all the way to dishwasher and kitchen sink, etc. The unit options so there's the numeric value for the amount of use that each service water heating fixture has, but these are describing the units. So maybe it would be power per person, volume per person, per area, or volume per area, or just a straight power or volume for describing the amount of use by that service water heating fixture. So the next data group that we want to talk about is tank. So remember that tanks are referenced from a few different places. They're referenced from service water heating equipment. They're referenced from service water heating distribution systems, in which case it could actually be multiple tanks. And there's also a reference from SolarThermal. So this data group shows up in a couple different places. So again, it has an ID, reporting name, and notes. And then the first and probably one of the most important things about a tank is its storage capacity. So that's a numeric value in liters. There's a type enumeration for the type of tank it is. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's the physical height of the tank in meters. And then there's whether there's insulation on the interior or exterior. So you'd basically be providing a R value in one of these two locations, or maybe both locations. And then the last two parameters have to do with where the tank is physically located. So the first is an enumeration for component location options. We've talked about that before, but we'll go over it again. And then if the option selected is in zone, then this is a reference to the location zone is a reference to that zone. So let's go over those couple of enumerations. So the first one was service water heating tank options. So these are categories for the type of tank, as well as notes as to what metric is used for each of these categories. So you can see that the categories are kind of a amalgam of categories from different standards, but it pretty much covers each type of tank that might be used. And then the notes indicate whether it's used for thermal efficiency, standby loss, or uniform energy factor. So those are the notes here. And then the component location talks about whether it's in zone. So if that's the one you use or that's selected, then you actually indicate the zone location. But then these others, we've seen these before, but basically they indicate the conditions for the outside of the tank and what losses that'll be experiencing. And they're generally not accounted for in the rest of the simulation. So if there's heat loss to a garage that's actually modeled as a zone, you'd put in zone. But if it's just garage, then there's an assumption made for the exterior conditions for the garage and what the heat loss would be for that. So the next data group that we're talking about is SolarThermal. And for those of you that are focused on 90.1, you'll know that there is currently no requirements for any kind of SolarThermal, but there are in other standards, I believe in Title 24 Residential. So there's an ID, reporting name, and notes. And then things that you'd normally expect for describing a solar collector. The angle from true north, the area, and the collector slope. So those are all things you'd kind of expect for any kind of descriptor of a collector. And then there's also something called solar saving fraction, and that is a metric based on a ICC standard. And then there's also an enumeration type of thing called collector type description. Is based on a description used in CBEC-COM. And at this point, we're just using it as a string instead of as an enumeration. We'll see what happens in the future. And then finally, there is a reference to a tank because there's pretty much no good way to collect hot water from solar without using some type of tank. So there's a reference to a tank here as well. So that's all that we're covering today. We're getting close to the end of the process. Next time we'll be covering refrigeration and probably trying to get a few ballots redone that failed earlier. Thanks for watching the video. That's it for today.